Chapter 6. When Connor woke her the following morning, she was certain she'd never be able to get out of bed and start working. She just didn't have it in her. Her feet hurt, and her back hurt, and she felt like she'd never be able to move again. She took one look at his face, though, and knew she couldn't disappoint him again. She had no desire to let him down the way she already had. She needed to do everything she could to prove to him that she could make it work. She crawled from the bed, feeling like death warmed over, but did her best to hide it from him. "I'm going to make breakfast this morning," she announced, "and I'm going to do it right." She felt as grumpy as she always did first thing in the morning, but she did her best to hide it. He grinned, kissing her softly. "That's my girl. I know you can." They went down the stairs and into the kitchen of the restaurant, and she immediately went into the cold room for the eggs and bacon while he started the fire in the stove and then started to mix up the dough for bread. She carefully heated the pan and then added the bacon before she mixed the eggs. This time she managed to break the eggs without getting a single shell in them. She added the milk and mixed it, then turned the bacon. She added the salt and pepper to the egg mixture and mixed it a little more before removing the bacon from the stove. She carefully poured the eggs into the frying pan and stirred them the same way she had the previous morning. They looked like they were right. She prayed they tasted good. She plated both of their meals and poured out their coffee, carrying it to the table. He prayed for them, and she watched as he took his first bite of eggs. He smiled and nodded at her. "These are delicious." He could tell she was anxious and was thrilled to be able to truthfully compliment her cooking. She breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you." She took a bite and smiled. He hadn't lied. She'd actually done it right. "I made a whole meal by myself." Yes, she knew it was a simple meal, because it was the first one that Berta tried to teach her to cook, but she didn't care. A meal was a meal, and she'd done it right. "It's quite an accomplishment." He squeezed her hand in his. "I'm glad you were the one to come out here and marry me." He realized that was the truth. She had lied about something that he'd considered extremely important, but she was a hard worker and willing to learn, and that was the most important thing. "Me too. I appreciate the man you are. I don't know of any other who would have been all right with the lie that I told." She took a sip of her coffee. "Back in Beckham, the lie seemed like nothing. I thought, oh, he won't mind. He's getting a wife after all. Berta tried to teach me to cook before I left, but I only had one day to try to learn, and honestly, I didn't think you'd care that much." She looked down at her lap as she said the words, knowing they would bother him, but needing to tell him everything. He frowned. "I care more about the lie than your inability to cook. I understand that you didn't feel it was important, and I'm not angry with you, but I do ask that you don't lie again." He watched her carefully, wondering how she'd respond. She shook her head. Having the lie come out the way it did was mortifying. "I learned my lesson." She would never lie to him again. She couldn't keep hurting him that way. He had been thinking hard about what they could do to change things, so that life wouldn't be so hard on her here, and he had an idea, but he wasn't going to bring it up just yet. When she got what she needed to do down, then they'd talk about it. Asterisk. For Millie, all the days blended together. She worked from the time she woke in the morning until she went to bed at night, with little respite. The only day that was different was Sunday, and it was only different because they had to get up a little earlier to open the restaurant a little later. She felt like she was constantly cooking, but she learned, and she learned well. By her third Monday of marriage, she was able to do all the regular cooking on her own, while Connor did the baking. She was so proud of herself for her accomplishments that she was all but dancing. She not only cooked all the meals that day, but she also served every single customer. Connor watched her carefully, nodding his encouragement. At the end of the day, While they were eating their supper, he told her his idea. "I think we should start having the restaurant only open for the lunch rush." He knew she hated the long hours, and he expected her to be excited. She stared at him in surprise. "But I finally learned that I can do it." Did he think she couldn't handle the fast pace of running a restaurant? He nodded. "You can do it. Here's my thinking on the matter, though. I didn't mind working 14-hour days when I was a single man, but now that I'm married, I want more time with my wife, and I don't want to see my wife work herself into an early grave. I know many women work those hours, but I don't want you to have to." He thought about her father never allowing her to work, and how as soon as he married her, she was forced to do nothing but work. She nodded, before asking, "But don't we need the money from the dinner hour? How would they make it with the big loss of income?" He was right, and well over half of their income from the restaurant was made at lunchtime, but surely they needed the supper income as well. Especially if they were going to get a house together someday. He shook his head. "Not with my idea. 1/4 of our income comes from the hotel. That will remain steady regardless. 3/4 of what's left of the income comes from our lunch rush. That's very little money that's coming in from supper time. I think we should close during supper, and instead, I will start baking and selling my baked goods. We'll work from 6 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, instead of from 6 in the morning until 8 or 9 at night. We'll still put in a good day's work. The bakery should more than make up for the lost income from closing at supper time, and should even bring in more money." She thought about his suggestion for a moment. "When would you want to start this?" She liked the idea of working shorter days. She would do what was necessary, but having more time with her husband would certainly be a welcome change. "Well, I think 1 more week of this, but we'll post on the door that the new hours will start on Monday of next week. We'll also post about the baked goods starting Monday of next week. People are always asking to buy my pies, and we never have enough. That way I could do custom cakes as well." He grinned, liking the idea of being able to use his creativity on cakes. "I like the idea. In fact, I love it." She took his hand across the small table. "My favorite part is getting to spend extra time with my husband." She wound her fingers through his, smiling at him as their eyes met. He brought her hand to his lips. "I like that part too." He wrote up a sign that they put on the front door, letting people know of the new hours and the bakery hours. Most people who talked to them were very excited about it, and they started making a list of the types of baked goods people in the town wanted. Through it all, Millie constantly worried that Connor wished it had been Berta to come to him instead of her. Oh, she knew he enjoyed their time in bed together, but he'd have enjoyed time there with Berta as well. And Berta would have been a great deal better in the kitchen. She knew she needed to do something to show him how good she was at helping people, and that she wasn't inferior to Berta. She wasn't even inferior to the perfect Berta who lived in his head. It was while she was in the lobby of the hotel one evening that it came to her. Poor widow Sanders had 2 small children, and her husband had been killed by someone trying to steal their land just a few months before. She sat one evening and talked to the widow for hours, working the details of her plan out in her mind. "Will you come to lunch at the restaurant tomorrow?" she asked. "Come around 2, and I'll feed the children in the kitchen so you can have a nice quiet meal for a change." John Bennett was there just before 2 every afternoon for his lunch, and Millie was convinced he and widow Sanders would be perfect for one another. John wanted a wife. Widow Sanders needed a husband and father for her children. Her boys were 5 and 7, and they were the wildest, most out-of-control boys Millie had ever seen. Of course, she thought of John Bennett when she looked at them. "Yes," Mary Sanders responded, nodding. "I'd be happy to do that." She seemed pleased at the invitation. Millie thought the other woman looked terribly tired all the time, and she wanted to help her, so she decided to make her a project. It would work out perfectly, just like all her plans did. Look how her plan to come to Idaho and marry him had worked out. She'd done well. She was happy to have found a way to show Connor that he'd been right to marry her. He would sing her praises once she found a good husband for the sweet widow. Chapter 6. Connor asked why Millie was watching the Sanders children that afternoon, but didn't have a problem with it even though he never got a straight answer. When she fed them chicken and dumplings, and the boys actually stayed put instead of tearing up his kitchen, he really didn't mind. When he'd first seen her bring them into the kitchen, he'd been skeptical about whether they'd sit still and behave. She served their two guests at the same table, waiting for them to strike up a conversation and become friends. She was certain the two would be engaged before dessert and married before the day was out, and then everyone would be singing her praises. It didn't quite work out as she'd planned, though. By dessert, the two were standing up and yelling at one another. It seemed that John thought that now she had no husband, Mary Sanders should sell him her ranch for pennies on the dollar so he could add it to his own sprawling acres. Mary, for her part, thought that John should stay on his land and her land should be left for her boys. When Millie carried their dessert into the dining room, she quickly put the pie down and rushed between them. "Oh, no, you mustn't fight. Don't you see? You two would be perfect for each other. John needs a wife, and you need a husband and father for your sweet boys." Millie hated to have to point out how brilliant her plan was to them. Why hadn't they seen it on their own? Sweet boys? John bellowed. Those two think throwing rocks at old women on their way to church is a good way to pass a Sunday morning. They're hellions and need to be beaten. Don't you call my boys names, John Bennett. I seem to recall you playing terrible pranks on everyone when you were a boy. That doesn't mean that I don't now see that it wasn't the right thing to do. Those boys need to be taken in hand, Mary. They're awful. Mary stomped as hard as she could on John's foot, before rushing to the kitchen to collect her boys. She wouldn't even look at Millie as she ran out the door and hurried back to the hotel, dragging a boy with each hand. John threw money onto the table to pay for his meal before stomping out the door, for once not trying to talk Millie into running away with him. Millie frowned as she was left alone in the dining room. That hadn't gone well, but it was because the people involved hadn't cooperated. She'd find some other way to show Connor that she was worthy of his love. There were any number of things she could do to impress him. She'd just have to stay on the lookout. Millie was in the mercantile the following afternoon, looking for fabrics, which were on the bottom shelf along the back wall. A young mother did her best to reach one of the jars of canned goods on the top shelf, but she couldn't get to it, so Millie got it down for her. She ended up getting down 4 jars for the younger woman. "Thank you so much. I wish you wouldn't put so many of the things I need up so high." As the other woman left, Millie looked at the wall. It did seem rather strange to her that the food would be up so high, but the fabric would be on the bottom. She didn't think twice about helping the store owner as she rearranged the shelves. She didn't know why no one ever arranged things in a logical manner. It only made sense that the things that people needed the most would be lower. She didn't care if she didn't get thanks for what she did. She simply wanted to help people. When she was finished, she took her purchases to the front and paid for them with a smile, knowing the proprietor would be thrilled with her work when he had a chance to notice it. He would surely see the logic of what she'd done. Just as she was leaving the store, she heard a loud crash and looked to the back. A child was standing with a broken jar scattered on the floor around him. Millie shook her head, hoping his mother would keep a better eye on him in the future. What kind of parent let their child run amok that way? She walked into the park and walked over to sit on the bench in front of the fountain. One of the ladies that she'd gotten to know since she'd been in town, Lila, approached her and sat down beside her. "How do you like Gullet Gulch?" Millie smiled and nodded happily. I love it here. I think it's a beautiful place. I feel like I belong here already. She stretched her feet out in front of her, carefully keeping her ankles crossed. The sun felt good on her face. It was mid-September, and it was already starting to get cooler. I'm glad. I was a little worried you would feel like you didn't fit in, what with you being a substitute bride and all. Do you ever hear from your friend Berta? That was the name of the woman who was supposed to marry Connor, right? Millie gritted her teeth. Yes, that was her name. We write every week. She was my very best friend back home, you know. She's expecting her first. She was pleased to see the other woman's reaction to her words. Lila looked shocked. Already expecting? How can that be? Millie smiled. I've been here a month, and she married over 2 weeks before I arrived. Plenty of time for her to be carrying. Millie didn't really know if her friend was carrying, but Berta had hinted that she thought she might be. Lila frowned. But why did you have to lock her in a closet and steal her train ticket if she was already married? Lock her in a closet and steal her train ticket? What makes you think I did that? Why would someone think she would do such a thing? She'd never done anything that bad in her life. Lila shook her head. That's just what I heard. Well, it wasn't true. Not at all. She married someone else and decided not to come, so I decided to take her place. Millie couldn't believe people were spreading rumors about her. Why, she'd thought everyone in town loved her up until that very moment. Even though you didn't know how to cook. Millie looked at Lila suspiciously. How did you know that I didn't know how to cook? She knew Connor wouldn't have told anyone that she couldn't cook. He just wasn't like that. Lila shrugged. Well, you weren't supposed to be waiting tables, you were supposed to be cooking. When you started out waiting tables, we all knew you couldn't cook. Poor Connor. He sure got the short end of that stick, didn't he? Millie stood, her back to the other woman. I have a lot of positive attributes, Lila. Perhaps if you weren't looking for only the negative, you'd find one or two. She worked hard to keep her temper in check as she walked. Why did the other woman think so little of her? She was a good person, and she couldn't imagine why anyone would think otherwise. She walked back to the hotel with her head held high. Why on earth had that woman chosen to say such terrible things to her? Millie had been nothing but loving and helpful since she'd arrived. Millie walked into the hotel lobby to find a sweet elderly gentleman sitting on a sofa along one wall waiting for someone. She immediately sat next to him. How are you today? Is there anything I can get you while you wait? She patted his hand as she spoke to him. The man shook his head sadly. Nothing anyone can get me anymore, I don't reckon. My wife is gone. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. She patted his hand softly. How did she die? Millie's heart ached for the sweet man. She couldn't imagine how her life would be if she ever lost Connor. He was her rock. Now, I don't recall saying she was dead. I said she's gone. She went out east on the last train to live with our daughter, Pamela. Said she couldn't stand to look at me or smell me for another minute. Millie forced herself not to wrinkle her nose at the man's words. He did smell rather ripe. You can't go to her? Why, if Connor left her that way, she'd be on the first train chasing him down. The man shook his head forlornly. I don't have no money to go with her. She took the last of the money we had. Oh, that's terrible. Millie dug some money out of the small drawstring purse that was attached to her wrist, pressing it into the man's hand. Why don't you follow your wife out east and see your daughter? Do you have grandchildren? She loved the idea of helping the sweet old man. Besides, she was certain the smell of the town could only be improved by his departure. No, ma'am. The man's eyes were sparkling as he smiled at her. "Thank you so much for your help. I'm so happy I could be of assistance," she told him. She was thrilled she'd done something nice for someone. She couldn't wait until Connor heard about it. Then he'd know she was the perfect wife for him. That night, just as they climbed into bed together, they heard gunshots from the street, followed by a body song. The voice sounded like that of the old man she'd helped earlier, but that just couldn't be. He was resting up for his journey east, wasn't he? Connor pulled her against him, her head on his shoulder. He sighed. "Who gave that old drunk money?" Millie propped herself up on her elbow and looked down at her husband. "Old drunk? What do you mean?" The sweet old man from earlier couldn't possibly have been a drunk. She'd have known, wouldn't she? "Have you not met old Pappy Cromwell yet? He's been trying to drink himself into an early grave since his wife left him 15 years ago. Mostly, he just sits around town and looks sad, but occasionally, he'll talk someone from the train into giving him money with some sob story about how he needs to follow his wife back east." He shook his head. "I wonder who it was this time." Millie didn't answer, her heart sinking. She'd meant well with Pappy. She really had. Sometimes, though, it seemed like every time she meant well, she messed things up. Today was just one of those days, she guessed. She'd find a way to make him love her tomorrow. She knew there was something she could do that would make him realize she was the perfect wife for him. Connor held her close, so thankful that she'd been the one to travel west to be his bride. There wasn't a woman who could be better for him on this whole planet. He wasn't happy that she'd lied to start with, but he could see that they would be happy for the rest of their lives. Someday soon, he was going to build her a house on the edge of town, and they'd live in it happily. He hadn't been able to propose marriage in a special way, but he would find a good way to tell her he loved her. Someday soon, he'd take her on a picnic up into the mountains and tell her she was sweet and special, and she deserved it. For a substitute wife, she was something really special. Millie fell asleep wondering how she'd convince him that she was worthy. There had to be something special she could do to make the whole town see that she wasn't just a substitute wife. She was the real thing. She kissed his bare shoulder as she snuggled against him, happy to have him beside her. She couldn't let him send her back to Massachusetts. There had to be a way she could prove to him that she was worthy of staying. Millie was working on preparing the food for the restaurant to open the following morning when the owner of the mercantile, the pastor, and a couple of the other men from town came into the kitchen. She wiped her hands on her apron and hurried over to where they were. "May I help you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice more than a little nervous. The pastor shook his head slightly, looking at Connor. "It's you we need to speak with if we may, Connor." Connor looked down at his hands, covered in dough. "Let me just wash my hands. I'll be out in a moment." He washed his hands and left the kitchen, the door swinging shut behind him. Millie knew it was rude, but she went over to listen at the door. She needed to know what the men wanted to talk to Connor about. She was his wife, and they shouldn't have any secrets from one another anyway. She stood with her ear to the door and listened. She could hear the pastor's voice loud and clear. "You've got to do something about your wife, Connor." Millie was startled. She'd thought maybe they'd come to tell Connor about the good she'd been doing around town, but apparently that wasn't the case. She frowned as she listened. The mercantile owner complained about her rearranging his shelf. I don't know what came over her. Everything was arranged perfectly, and the next thing I knew, she'd moved all the jars of canned goods to the bottom shelf, and before I had time to put everything back where it goes, little Timmy Jacobs had broken 6 jars of vegetables on the floor. We're lucky the poor tyke didn't seriously injure himself. Millie bristled. She'd only been helping. It was the Timmy's mother's fault for not watching him. Why didn't they see that? I'm sure she was just trying to help, Connor said in her defense, and Millie smiled, glad that someone was on her side. Do you think she was trying to help when she showed the Larson boys how to use a slingshot properly? They shot out 2 of the stained glass windows on the church, the pastor complained. Millie frowned. The boys had been holding the slingshots upside down. Was she supposed to just walk away and let the other children laugh at them? She gave old Pappy money yesterday, and he shot out one of my windows, someone else protested. Did you know she tried to get Mary Sanders to marry John Bennett? Those 2 have hated each other since they were knee-high to a grasshopper. What is the woman thinking? She didn't recognize the voice that said that. Slowly, she left the door and went back to work, preparing the food for the day. Did the whole town see her as some sort of idiot who could do nothing right? She couldn't stay somewhere where she wasn't appreciated, but where would she go? She certainly couldn't go back to Beckham, because she would be laughed at. Finally, she hit on the idea. She'd heard the mountains near Gullet Gulch were riddled with caves. She'd go live in a cave somewhere. First she'd have to learn to shoot, though, but she had money. She could pay one of the local teenage boys to teach her to shoot. How hard could it be? When Connor came back into the kitchen, he looked angry, but he said nothing to her about the conversation with the men in the dining room. She knew he was angry with her though. How could he not be? She was angry with herself when she heard all the things she'd done wrong listed at one time. They worked together in silence, with him unable to meet her eyes. That's how she knew he was angry with her. He'd never avoided her eyes before, not even when he'd found out she couldn't cook. She would have to put her plan in action. That afternoon, while Connor was doing the books for the hotel, she caught one of the teens on their way home from school. "Do you know how to shoot?" she asked. She knew he'd know how, because all boys could shoot, couldn't they? The boy nodded. "I hunt all the time." "Why?" "Well, I want to learn to shoot." "Do you think you could teach me?" "I would pay you." She'd never imagined that she would ask a boy to teach her to shoot, but her plan wouldn't work if she had no way to defend herself. He studied her for a minute. "Girls can't shoot." "It would have to be a lot." Millie thought about what a 14-year-old boy would consider a lot. "How about 50 cents? His eyes widened, and he nodded eagerly. "You got a gun?" "No, and I don't want my husband to know about this, so would you buy one for me?" "I'll give you the money." She was certain with the way the mercantile owner felt about her, he'd never sell her a rifle anyway. She took $10 from her purse and handed it to him. "Is this enough?" His eyes gaped, and he nodded. "I'll go get it now." "Going to get you some ammunition too." "Wait, before you run off, you need to at least tell me your name." She didn't dare let him leave with her money without knowing his name. What if he never came back? She'd be out $10. "It's Lewis." "Lewis Stockton." She nodded, watching as he ran off toward the mercantile. He met her in the park 10 minutes later with a gun and a small bag that he said was shells. "Let's go to the woods." "I don't think it's a good idea for you to teach me out in the open like this." Truly, with the luck she'd been having, she was certain that if she learned to shoot in town, she'd simply shoot a passerby. He walked toward the woods just outside of town. "I got you a shotgun, because it's easier to aim. You have so many pellets shooting out, it's hard to miss your target." She nodded. "That sounds smart." She didn't want to miss her target, whether it was a bear or a deer. She needed to be able to shoot well. When they got to the woods, Lewis showed her how to load the shotgun, explaining what each part of the gun was called, and then showed her how to aim and shoot. She hated holding the gun, but knew if she was going to make it for any length of time up on the mountain, she'd need to be able to shoot. They practiced for several hours until she realized it was getting dark. "I need to get home. Do you think I'm ready to go out on my own?" She watched him carefully, hoping that he'd say yes, but she was prepared to ignore him if he said no. He made a face. "I dunno, lady. You probably need a few more lessons." "Could I protect myself if I needed to?" she asked. That was the bottom line for her. If a bear was coming at her, could she shoot it and not die? He nodded reluctantly. "I guess so." She took 50 cents from her purse and handed it to him. "Thank you for the lesson." She quickly walked back to the hotel after hiding her shotgun in the woods where it wouldn't be found. She would leave after work the following day. Poor Connor didn't need to have his reputation ruined by her help for even another day. Chapter 7. Connor never asked where she'd been when she arrived home, and he didn't talk to her about what the men had said in the restaurant, which surprised her. When she rolled to him in bed that evening, she clung to him, wanting a beautiful experience to remember. She loved Connor with all her heart and hated that she had to leave him, but his town was rejecting her, and his business was there. She really had no choice. Business was booming the following day. She was astonished at the sheer number of people who came through, and served everyone with a forced smile. It was hard to want to smile when she knew every one of them hated her and wanted her gone. She had hidden a small carpet bag in the woods during the night. It had her clothes and her shotgun in it, along with a big jar of water. Really, what else would she need? She'd be living up in the mountains, and she'd have no problems living off nature. Now that she could cook, it all seemed so terribly simple. She should have thought of it sooner. After work, she kissed Connor sweetly, clinging to him, and told him she was going for a walk. He nodded, his eyes filled with passion for her. "Be home before dark," he called after her. She had an odd look on her face as she left, and he worried that she was up to something. She walked away from him without looking back, certain she wouldn't be able to go if she glanced back over her shoulder at him. He was wearing his usual outfit of pants, a button-up shirt, and a cowboy hat. When she'd asked him why he always wore the cowboy hats, even though he wasn't a cowboy, he'd shrugged. "I like them better than a chef's hat." Millie couldn't argue with his reasoning. When she got to the woods, she found her bag and looked out toward the mountain. She knew she probably couldn't make it all the way to the mountain before dark, and she certainly couldn't try to climb the mountain after dark, so she'd have to spend one night sleeping outside. As she walked, she cried, thinking about how much she was going to miss Connor. He'd been a good husband to her, even thought she wasn't the wife he'd sent away for, and she'd started their marriage with a lie. Every little sound in the woods made her jump, afraid there was a bear or a mountain lion close. She didn't even know what animals were indigenous to the area. She wished she had a dog to accompany her, but she didn't. She reached the base of the mountain much faster than she'd expected, because she'd practically run through the woods. She circled the mountain and found a small cave near the base, which she quickly decided would be her new home. She slowly moved through the cave, looking for any animals that might be living in it, with her shotgun at her side. How could she possibly make it through the night with as afraid as she was? She went to the mouth of the cave and started a fire, thinking that would be the best way to scare off animals. It was chilly, and the fire gave off a nice warmth. She opened her jar of water and took a drink before she realized she was hungry. What was she going to eat? Living off the land sounded easy, but would she be able to actually do it? She walked out of the cave for a moment, having to squint into the setting sun. She looked around for any edible plants, but she didn't really know which plants were edible. She frowned. Why had she assumed she would just find carrots and potatoes lying around ready for her to consume? Millie knew she was going to have to shoot something, and she absolutely dreaded the idea. How would she be able to shoot an animal and then ready it to cook? Maybe she should have thought her plan through a little better. She sat in the entrance to her cave for a moment. Skipping supper sounded like a very good idea for that evening, and then she could get up early in the morning and worry about food then. It wouldn't hurt her a bit to skip food for one night. Leaning against the wall of the cave, she felt her eyes drooping. Surprised that she was so tired, she moved back into the cave a bit further and laid down. Why hadn't she thought to bring a pillow and something to use for a mattress? The hard cave floor wasn't pleasant. She'd had her eyes closed for less than a minute when she heard a commotion at the front of the cave. Sitting up, she squinted into the darkness. The fire gave off a little light, and she could see the shape of something towering at the entrance to the cave. Reaching behind her, she groped for her shotgun, bringing it to her shoulder. The gun was snatched from her hand. "You're going to hurt someone with this." Connor stood over her, and he placed the shotgun against the wall behind him. "Now tell me why you left me to come live in some cave." He sat down beside her, not touching her, but very intent. She could see by the dim firelight that he looked very sad. She sighed. "It wasn't so much that I left you as I left the town. They think I'm a troublemaker." She looked down at her hands. Millie still couldn't believe anyone would think that of her. She'd only tried to help. Connor sighed. "They did think that, yes, but I convinced them otherwise. They know now that you were only trying to be helpful." He reached out and patted her arm, thrilled that it hadn't been him to make her leave. "Does that mean you didn't want to leave me?" He had felt like a failure as a husband when he found out she'd left him, but he couldn't think of a thing that he'd done wrong. He'd been beating himself up the entire way, trying to figure out how he'd failed her. Millie threw herself into his arms, burying her face in his neck. "Of course, I didn't want to leave you, but I didn't want to cause you any more trouble. I was afraid that if I stayed, people would stop eating at the restaurant and stop being your friend." She couldn't bear for him to be ostracized and have to go out of business just because people didn't like her. His arms came around her and he stroked her back, a grin on his face. "I have the only restaurant in town. Of course they won't stop coming." He was so happy that she hadn't wanted to leave him that he could barely contain it. "I never thought of that." She sighed, happy to have him with her again. "When I got out here, I started looking for vegetation I could eat, and I realized I didn't know what I could eat." "You didn't bring any food, did you?" She was starving and couldn't help but hope he had thought of food. Connor wanted to laugh, but knew it would hurt her feelings. His pretty little wife always had the best intentions, but she didn't have the best grasp on how to make things work for her in reality. "I brought a bag full of food." He pulled away and looked down into her eyes. "Would you like me to go get it?" His eyes sparkled with laughter, but he asked the question with a straight face. She nodded enthusiastically. "I'm starving." He got up and moved to the mouth of the cave, coming back with bread and butter and some ham. He also pulled out a big jar of water. He put it all on a plate for her and handed it to her. "There. Thank you." Just before she bit into the sandwich, she asked, "How did you know I left so soon?" She had expected him to realize she was missing when she wasn't home before dark. It had never occurred to her he'd figure it out so soon. "Well, Louis, the boy who taught you to shoot is the son of a friend of mine. He came to me and told me you wanted to learn to shoot, but he wasn't supposed to tell me about it, which made me think something was happening." He shook his head, thinking about how Louis had come to him. "Mr. O'Reilly?" Louis has said as he'd popped into the restaurant on his way home from school. "Yes?" Connor had looked at the boy, wondering what he was doing there. They barely knew one another. "That crazy wife of yours paid me to teach her how to shoot a shotgun, and said something about going out shooting on her own. I'm worried she might be planning something that won't be good for her or anyone else in town." Connor had nodded. "I'm sure whatever she has planned, she means well." He worried that it wouldn't go well either, but he wouldn't tell Millie that. As hard as she tried, she did always seem to fall short. "Yes, sir." Louis left right after that, and Connor had gone to see if anyone knew where his wife was. Coming back to the present, Connor said, so then I left the restaurant to look for you. You weren't in our room, so I went to the front desk. They said you'd been seen heading for the woods, so I found where you'd hidden your bag of clothes. He rubbed the back of his neck. So I went back to the restaurant and packed a big bag of food, and put a sign on the door saying we'll be closed tomorrow, and then I came looking for you. He shrugged. It all seemed like a logical way of doing things to him. How do you know where I hid my bag? She asked, between bites of her food. How could he possibly know something like that? You buried your things under some leaves, but that obviously changed the leaves in that part of the woods. I could tell something had been hidden there, and I figured it was you, because you were the only one missing. He shrugged. I walked through the woods, noticing where you'd snapped a tree branch here and there. You left a nice little trail for me. By the time I got to the base of the mountain, I could see your fire. I just followed the smoke, and there you were. She swallowed the last of her sandwich. You're not mad? She knew she'd be mad if he'd taken off on her that way. Connor shook his head. How could I be angry? I knew you were doing it to help me. Millie grimaced. Some help I am. I heard the men in town complaining about me yesterday. I thought so. Why didn't you yell at me for messing so many things up? She really didn't understand him at all. I will never yell at you for having good intentions, and you are filled with good intentions. Never have I met anyone who tried so hard to help others. And did so badly at it, he added silently. Why don't you start coming to me when you want to help someone, and we'll plan out how to do it together? He could stop her craziest plans that way and quite possibly steer her in the right direction. Millie nodded. Does that mean you want me to come back? She couldn't believe he wasn't happy to be rid of her. Connor nodded. I can't let you go. I love you too much. She stared at him, astonished that he could say that. You love me? Why would you love me? I don't ever seem to do anything right. She couldn't believe he would tell her that. It couldn't possibly be the truth. He pulled her to him, hugging her tightly. You do so many things right. Do you know how happy I am it was you on that train and not your friend? You make me laugh and bring me joy. But she could cook. How could he be happy it was her and not Berta? She knew Berta was the right wife for him. He shrugged. So can you now. It only took me a couple of weeks to teach you, because you wanted to learn so badly. If you had come here not knowing how to cook and told me that you weren't willing to try to learn, that would have been different. You not only tried, but you succeeded. You have several meals you can make now, and you do a good job with them. He stroked her cheek softly. Every morning, I'm thankful that you came into my life. I love you, Millie O'Reilly. Millie hugged him, sighing contentedly. I fell in love with you within minutes of getting off the train. I knew you had to be the one I married. I even wished that you would fall in love with me on the fountain in the park that day. She grinned at the memory, happy the fountain had listened to her wish. Connor smiled, kissing the top of her head. That was a good thing to wish for. He looked around the cave and sighed. We're going to have to sleep here tonight. He hated the idea, but there was no way to make it back to town in the dark. It was just too dangerous. She frowned. It's not very comfortable here. She'd hoped they'd be able to go back instead of spending the night. We'll find a way to make it comfortable. He left the cave for a moment and came back with an armful of pine needles that he dropped to the floor of the cave and left again. He made 3 trips that way, putting the needles down almost an inch thick along the cave floor. Then he removed his clothes, piling them over the pine needles. Once she saw what he was doing, she did the same, opening her bag and spreading out more dresses on top of it. They each used a petticoat for a pillow, and she snuggled close to him. I'm so glad you came to find me. I don't know what I would have done otherwise. She had already been nearing panic mode, worrying about the strange noises she'd heard. I like to think you would have come home to me. He shook his head. Why didn't you just catch a train back to Massachusetts? He didn't understand her thinking at all, and he probably never would. Because everyone would have assumed I made a mistake in marrying you then. Getting on that train in Beckham was the best thing I've ever done. She couldn't bear the idea of going home with her tail between her legs as if she'd made a huge mistake. Marrying Connor had been a good thing for her, not a bad thing. So it was pride? Connor asked. She sighed. Yes, it probably was. I hate it when people tell me not to do something and it doesn't work out for the best. It makes me crazy. Berta was certain you'd hate me and send me right back home. I couldn't go now, because she'd think she was right. She was so happy Berta was wrong. She was a good wife to him, no matter what Berta or any of the townspeople thought of her. Connor stroked her back, sighing. Well, you're going to have to face the town when you go back tomorrow. I know. She rested her head on his shoulder. You don't think we could just live here, do you? It's a nice cave. Very roomy. No, Millie, we really can't. How would we make a living? I haven't spent a lot of time thinking this through yet. He laughed. I'll be right beside you when we go back to town. I promise. He closed his eyes. We need to get some sleep. We have a long walk ahead of us tomorrow. Chapter 8. Connor and Millie walked back to town hand in hand. He carried her bag of clothes for her, and she carried the empty sack that had once held their food. I really don't want to have to face anyone, she said. They all think terrible things about me. She could see the hotel from where she was and wondered if she made a run for it if she could be in their room before anyone caught up with her. He shook his head. No, they really don't. I gave them my opinion of how they've treated you, and they all agreed to be more understanding. He still felt overwhelmed with anger when he thought about how the townspeople had talked to him about her as if she were an errant child. You did? Really? He nodded. When they all came into the restaurant, I told them that they hadn't given you a chance at all. They were complaining about every little thing you have done since you got there, but I pointed out how hard you'd worked, and how you only ever had anyone's best intentions at heart. What did they say to that? She wondered if they had been angry with him for standing up for her. I think they were all embarrassed to have complained that way. They could see that you're a good loving woman, even though they all looked for the bad in you. You were looking for the good in them and always looking for ways to help them. He squeezed her hand tightly. I'm proud of the woman you are. When they walked back into town, several of the people who lived along the main street came out of their houses to greet them. The owner of the mercantile was the first to reach them. We're so glad you're all right, he said, squeezing Millie's arm. Millie smiled. I'm sorry, I messed up your display. I really was just trying to help. She didn't explain her reasons for reorganizing the shelves, because they suddenly didn't seem to matter. He nodded. I know that now. I wasn't very kind to you, and I'm sorry for that. What surprised Millie the most was seeing John Bennett and Mary Sanders walking toward her, each of them holding the hand of one of her sons. John smiled at Millie. We're getting married. Millie looked back and forth between the two in shock. But didn't they hate each other? John laughed. My ma and her pa were childhood sweethearts. They had a big fight, and each ended up marrying other people. We tried to court when we were both still in school, but our parents put a stop to it as fast as they could. Mary nodded. My pa insisted that I marry William Sanders immediately, because he didn't want there to be any chance of me changing my mind. He told me that John had two other girls he was courting at the same time, so I married William. And all I knew was that she'd married some other man within a week of telling me she loved me. John shook his head. You got us to start talking that day. Sure, we started out by yelling, but we ran into each other later, and really talked. He slipped his arm around Mary's shoulders and hugged her to him. So now, thanks to you, I get a wife and 2 sons. Millie was thrilled. I can't believe it. I'm so happy for both of you. She wanted to shout from the rooftops that she really had done something good for the couple. She wondered if anyone would even listen. Mary smiled. We wanted you to be the first person we invited to the wedding. I would absolutely love to come. When is it? Millie asked, looking over at Connor, who was grinning at her. John shrugged. How about right now? I don't see a reason to wait. Oh, but then we can't have a big party afterward. Connor could bake your wedding cake, and I could make a good meal for everyone there. Please wait a few days. Mary and John shared a look, both of them shaking their heads adamantly. If we wait, something else will go wrong, Mary told her. We have to do it now. She leaned forward and whispered, before my pa finds out. More than 20 people had gathered on the street to welcome Millie back to town and let her know that they wanted her there. A boy of about 14 ran ahead to tell the pastor to meet them at the church. Millie stood beside Mary while she said her vows, dashing happy tears from her eyes the whole while. Now that she'd brought Mary and John together, everyone was sure to agree that her ideas were good and she was an asset to the town. It only took one thing. Millie couldn't have been happier for the couple, and she kept looking at Connor, who acted as if he were the proud father of the bride. He beamed so much. After the wedding, he invited everyone to the restaurant. I have several pies that I baked yesterday afternoon just waiting to be eaten. They all hurried to the restaurant, where Millie put on 2 pots of coffee and served pie to all the people. Several people told her during the course of the makeshift party that they were right glad she'd ended up married to Connor and not her friend. Looks like you weren't a substitute bride after all. Long after everyone had left, she kept those words in mind as she climbed the stairs to their room. Connor had decided to do a bit of paperwork, while she went up to their room to write a letter to Elizabeth Miller. She sat with her back to the head of the bed and put her pencil to paper. Dear Elizabeth, I'm so glad you helped me to come out here and marry Connor. I feel like I'm where God wants me to be. I've done a lot of good in this small town already, and I know I can do more. My heart is simply overflowing with love for my new husband, and I wanted to thank you once again. Please keep in touch, and never stop the good you're doing. Sincerely, Millie. Millie put the letter on the dresser, to be mailed the following day. Could life get any better? When Connor joined her for bed, he brought up a subject that she'd wanted to discuss for a while, but hadn't wanted to make him feel like anything in her life was lacking. I just looked at our finances. We have enough saved to buy a house. It'll have to be a small house, but the Grimsleys just moved out of town, and their house is for sale. He watched her face, hoping she'd be happy with the idea of a house. He knew she didn't like living in the hotel. Millie stared at him in shock. Really? Do you mean it? She didn't complain about their lack of space in the hotel, but every day she dreamed of moving. I would love that. He smiled. We'll talk to the estate agent about it tomorrow. Thank you. A house is all I need to make my dream complete. She couldn't believe he was even offering it to her. That's all? You don't want, maybe a child? He winked at her. Millie blushed. I think that's going to happen soon enough. I'd love to have a child by this time next year. Her hand went to her belly, thinking about how it would feel to have his child kicking inside her. Connor smiled, climbing into bed beside her. I would like that as well. He stroked her cheek with one finger. I got a letter from home yesterday. My brother has decided to move to Idaho because of all the good things I've said about this place. He wants to help run the restaurant. Would you mind? He quickly added, don't worry, he'll take our room in the hotel. He won't live with us. She smiled. That sounds wonderful. Maybe we can take days off together occasionally if we have someone to help. I promise you, when he gets here, we'll start taking off at least one day every week. We don't need to keep working this way with Sean coming. She sighed happily, leaning against him. 2 months ago, I never would have dreamed I could be as happy as I am today. She pressed her lips to his, suddenly thrilled with her life. Her husband loved her. The town loved her. And she had a great many ideas for making everything around them better. Life was going to get interesting very soon.